I love this church. You guys have so much heart, and it just does me so much good. It just does me so much good. Our gospel today comes from the Gospel of Matthew, and Jesus continues in storyteller mode. Another parable Jesus put before the crowds. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that someone took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all the seeds, but when it's grown, it's the greatest of shrubs and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in with 3 measures of flour until it was all leavened. The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which someone found and hid. Then in his joy he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls. On finding one pearl of great value, he went and sold all that he had and bought it. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was thrown into the sea and caught fish of every kind. When it was full, they drew it ashore, sat down, and put the good into baskets, but threw out the bad. So it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come out and separate the evil from the righteous and throw them into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Have you understood all this? They answered, yes. And he said to them, therefore every scribe who has been trained for the kingdom of heaven is like the master of a household who brings out of his treasure what is new and what is old. Let us pray. May your words only be spoken, O Lord, and your words only heard, and we ask this all for your love's precious sake. Amen. Please be seated. Kids Chapel. Yep, Kids Chapel. Well, I can finally turn over my timeline so I don't have to keep looking at this. It's been a bit disconcerting. I don't know what that is. Someone's excited about Kids Chapel. Well, I think it was Wednesday this week. I forget what night it was, but I got in about 9:30 and was returning phone calls, and there was a phone call on my cell phone. It didn't say who the call was from, just the number, and said, "Did you get my email?" Yeah. And sometimes it's easier just to make a phone call instead of keeping the phone call change. I figured if I needed to see the email, there was some response that I needed to make, and so I figured, I'll just call this person back. So I just hit redial and to see who I'd get, and I got Ernie Bennett, who was my first boss way back in Florida, however many years ago, who just retired from being a priest after 40-some years. And he was in New York. Even though he's retired, he had just met with our presiding bishop, Catherine Shoring, about some exciting new possibilities for him in his life. And we talked for about an hour, maybe even a little bit more. And in the course of that conversation, he said, "So what are you preaching on this week?" And I said, "Well, you know, the good news is that one of my assistants is preaching this week. I don't have to preach, and so I actually haven't really even looked at the lessons." And he said, "Oh." He said, "Well, I'm preaching this week." He said, "And I'm preaching on the Isaac and Rachel story." And he said, "And I have no idea what I'm going to say about that. I mean, holy cow, what do you say about that story?" And so we talked a little bit about that, and so I got to thinking about the lessons. And then about 7 o'clock, 6:45 this morning, I got a phone call from Ann saying, "I am deathly sick." And Ann was the one who was scheduled to preach today. And she said, I'm not able to be there. Can you do it? So I guess I am preaching this week after all. And I am thankful to have at least had the conversation with Ernie a little earlier in the week to begin thinking about this. This is all sort of in a rough form, things I've been thinking about. And it comes actually from the Old Testament stories. We don't read the Old Testament stories at this service, but I commend them to you. In fact, I commend the whole book of Genesis to you, because if you really want to read a book that sort of tells the quintessential story of what it means to be a human being in a fallen world, Genesis is that book. I mean, they're just compelling stories. And this is the saga of Jacob. And Jacob was a deeply dishonest, duplicitous, lying cheat of a man. And yet this is the person that God is going to use to father all of his redemptive activity in the world from that point on. It's an incredible story of a guy who just seems to have so little going for him. And yet this is the one person God, by his grace, chooses to touch and lift up and accomplish his works in the world. And how that happens is just an amazing, amazing, amazing story. And in many ways, I feel like it's my story, and that's the point. The point is, when you read this story, you say, that's my story. It's not just Jacob's story. It's not just something happened a long, long time ago. This is my story. A man who wasn't what he wanted to be, and who God, by his grace, reached down into his life and worked in him and helped him become the man that he one day just hoped and dreamed that he'd become. A man who too often sat on the sidelines, but who learned how, in halting steps and however imperfectly, to dance. And, that's the story. That's the Jacob story. It's a compelling story, and I hope you'll read it. The story starts it starts before this, but I'm going to pick it up, and it starts when Jacob is born. And Jacob is twins. His twin brother is Esau. You may remember that. Esau is born a very hairy man, and there's a little funny saying about that, but we won't go into that. And when he's born, the story is told, and this is included in the Bible, that Jacob reached out and grabbed his brother's heel as if to pull him back in the womb so that he could get out first. And in fact, the name Jacob means supplanter, deceiver, cheat. Even though Esau was the firstborn, Jacob was the one who wanted the rights from the very start. He wanted the rights and privilege of being the firstborn. In that society, firstborn got everything. And so the story is told that from the very start, Jacob wanted what was not rightfully his. He wanted what his brother had. Now, we have to ask ourselves, how did that story get told? I mean, who knew from the very start that Jacob reached out and grabbed his brother's heel? Well, the only one who was there would have been his mom. And so his mom must have seen that. And so from the very start, she said, from the very start, and Jacob was her favorite. Jacob was her favorite. She wanted Jacob to enjoy the rights. And so from the very start, she told the story, when you were coming out, you grabbed your brother's heel because you wanted to have his place. You always were an overachiever. You always, wanted the best. You always took what was yours. You can think of how she might have told a different story. When you were coming out of the womb, you grabbed your brother's heel and you helped him out. You gave him a little push to help him get out of that womb. From the very start, you have always been in your brother's corner. From the very start, man, if there was ever someone who was on your brother's side, it was you. From the very start, nobody has ever loved their brother as well as you've loved yours. You took his heel and you literally helped him out of the womb. You came out second that he might be first. What a different story that would have been. And it makes me think about the kinds of stories that we often tell, and the kind of stories that we often tell in our families. The things that we notice, the things that we don't, the things that we perpetuate, the things that we don't, and how those stories may not always serve us as well as we think they would, as we wish they would. We tend to notice things like physical appearance, power, position, prestige, and we don't tend to notice things like compassion, forgiveness, generosity, courage. And you can think, of some of the stories that we often hear people tell. So people often tell the story, oh yeah, such a strong-willed child. I've got such a strong-willed child. And I'm not thinking of anybody. I'm just stories that, that you hear. And there's the strong-willed child. Okay, there's probably a good side to that. Persistent, stick-to-itness. But often what we mean by strong-willed is a kid doesn't know how to obey limits or respect authority. And so if a kid has grown up hearing, I don't know how to obey limits or respect authority, then that is a curse and not a blessing. And so if that's the story we tell, we might want to think about that story. There's got to be a better way to tell that story than I have such a strong-willed child that they don't listen to anybody or anything. Well, if that's the story we want to tell, somebody's going to pay for that story someday. And it's not going to be a pretty picture. We tell a lot of times, for instance, just another one, the princess story. And there's a great part to the princess story. The princess story, we live in a day and age where women can have power, and that's a beautiful thing. We can tell the princess story in a way where women know how deeply they are loved and valued, and that's a beautiful thing. But if we're telling the princess story in such a way that a kid from the very start begins to perceive themselves as privileged and as privileged, that everybody around them should sort of bow down to them, that they have a privilege that other people might not have, that's not a good story. I mean, we might want to think about the story that we're telling. From the very start, one of the things that Linda did so well, and she did this better than I did, is she would, and this was true, but of course it's all what you focus on. She said, Mary, from the time you guys were young, Mary's my younger daughter, Christine's my older daughter, she said, you always had Christine's back. Even before you could talk, if Christine cried, you'd be crying too. And if Christine was upset, you were even more upset. You were always so in tune with your sister that you were always feeling what she was feeling, and you were always sticking up for her. And that would be true. I mean, when I would make Christine mad, which I would do with some frequency, Mary would just get right up in my face. Dad, you leave her alone. And I mean, literally, sometimes she would physically put herself, between us. And some of my fondest memories of my little Mary are her championing her sister. And to this day, there is nobody more squarely in Christine's corner than Mary. She always has Christine's back. She's always on Christine's side. And it's, I would say, in no small part, because of the stories that Linda always told her, the way that she helped her envision and understand herself. So the first thing that this helps us think about is the stories we tell in our family, the stories we tell, how those stories shape us, and whether those are the stories we really want to tell. There might not be better stories that emphasize other things, and that those might not be the kind of things that we really want to emphasize. Well, as this story goes on, so Jacob grows up thinking of himself as a supplanter, as a deceiver, that he needs to get what's his own. And so last week in the story, and many of you will know the story, some of you haven't heard it, but it's a great story, you should read it. Jacob, his mom, gives him a way to trick his brother and to get his birthright. So Esau, who's a hunter, a very physical man, who goes out in the field and he's got a bunch of game, and he comes back in and he's starving. And his brother, who is much more of a delicate type, he's inside cooking, and he's made this stew. And his brother smells the stew, and he says, oh man, that smells so good. I'd love to have something to eat. And coached by his mother, Jacob says, well, I'll tell you what, I'll give you something to eat if you sell me your birthright. And he says, well, what good's my birthright to me if I die of starvation here in this spot? Give me the stew, and I'll give you my birthright. And so that's what happens. Well, of course, once Esau has eaten the stew and he realizes that he's been tricked, he says, okay, Jacob, you might be good at cheating. I'm good at killing. And if I kill you, I've got my birthright back. And so Jacob's got to head for the hills because Esau now is hell-bent on killing him. And there's another great story a little bit further down the line when Jacob will meet Esau again. And Jacob puts all of his family, all of his cattle, all of his kids, you talk about human shields, he puts everybody out in front of him before he meets Esau because he figures there's hell to pay. So he tricks his brother, he runs off, he comes into this situation, he meets this guy named Laban, he wants to marry his daughter Rachel, and so he enters into the works 7 years so he can marry her. End of 7 years, they have the wedding day, and the bride's veiled, so he can't really see her face. They consummate the marriage in the darkness. Wakes up the next morning. He didn't get Rachel, he got her older sister, Leah. And he is understandably upset. And you guys don't read the Old Testament. I mean, come on now. Could anything be more interesting than this? This is really an interesting story. I mean, think of the kind of movie this would make. It's just a pretty incredible stuff. So he's understandably upset, but get what's just happened. He's been cheated, tricked. And when he says, when he goes to Laban and says, this is what you did, he said, well, you know what? You can't take, in our culture, you can't give away the firstborn's rights to the secondborn. See, the firstborn, Leah, needs to be given before the secondborn has any say in the matter. So not only is he being cheated, he's being cheated in the exact way that he cheated his brother. What goes around comes around. And, that's sort of an inevitable, in my mind, that's sort of an inevitable law of life. It's that law of sowing and reaping. What we sow is what we reap. And that's exactly what happens with him. And so he finds himself in this situation really of his own creating. And You know, if you put this over against a psalm today, Psalm 128, it says, "Blessed are those who walk in the ways of the Lord." And it just talks about how blessed people are who walk in God's ways. And it's not a matter of God saying you have to do it this way. It's just a matter of God knowing how the universe works. And so when we live in harmony with that, we live in harmony with the universe, and we enjoy the benefits of being in harmony with the way things are. Just like we observe the law of gravity, we don't break our leg. And you put that over against Jacob's life, where he didn't walk in the ways of the Lord. He walked in the ways where he was duplicitous and cheated, and he ends up with a ton of regrets. He ends up alienated from his brother. He ends up alienated from his family. He ends up not being able to cheat anybody. He ends up with a wife he doesn't want. He ends up with just a ton of regrets. And I look at my life, and my friend Big Al was in town this last week, and we talked for several hours on Thursday night after the meeting I had that evening. And, you know, we just talked about our lives. And you know, I'm 56. He's a little bit older than that. I think I'm 56. And, you know, there's a lot I'm proud of. I've done a lot of good work, but there's a lot I regret, too. There's a lot I regret. And frankly, I'm sort of surprised at this point in life by how much and how deep some of my regrets go. But when I look at that, whenever I have been faithful to what I know is right, to the things that Jesus teaches, to what we learn in the pages of Scripture, to what I've been reminded of weekly here, to what the best people here have inspired and encouraged me to do, I have always benefited, and the people around me have always benefited. I have been blessed. But whenever I have strayed from those things, I've reaped what I've sowed. And the sad part is, often the people around me have as well. So it's a powerful story about reaping what we're sowing, and how important it is that we sow well. That we sow well. That we really do think about God's ways and how well our ways line up with those ways, because those are the ways of life. And you don't need to understand that in some sort of tribal authoritarian way to appreciate that principle. And then the final thing that I just say about this, and this is in many ways the most fascinating of all, is he grows up in this family that's marked by competition, duplicity, dishonesty. He grows up in this family where mom and dad aren't on the same page. And he comes into a new family, and by golly, it looks just like the family he left. And it's such an interesting thing, the way life and history tends to repeat itself. Because in our families in which we grow up, we're shaped by what's comfortable to us, and we just naturally gravitate towards that, and that's how those things are passed on. So I want you to consider this with me. I want you to consider this is a syllogism. It's A equals B equals C, and then A equals what? C. All right. So you already know that when I grew up, my dad was the youngest of 11 kids. He was never shown much affection. And so until he had a conversion experience, it really changed his life, where he really tried to love like he experienced God loving him. He didn't pay much attention to us because he had no way of knowing how to do that. They had no role model, nothing that would. And so I grew up in a family where, you know, my dad didn't pay much attention to me, where I didn't see a lot of interaction between my wife and him. And so when I would grow up, you know, Linda would ask me about my day. You know, my answer was generally a one-word answer. How was your day? And my answer was, fine. And that was kind of it. And so I went away on a business trip one time. Christine was maybe 4 or 5 years old. And I called Christine, and I said, "Christine, how was your day?" What did Christine say? And she left it at that. And I started thinking about that, and I realized this. I thought, you know, Linda sees dad, or Christine sees dad loves mom. A. Dad doesn't talk on any meaningful level to mom. Dad doesn't talk to mom. He doesn't share his heart, mind, and soul with her. He doesn't. So she says, let's see. I love Dad like Dad loves Mom. So that means if I love Dad, what does that mean? She doesn't talk to Dad. If A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. If Dad loves Mom and he doesn't talk to Mom, if I love Dad like Dad loves Mom, I don't talk to Dad. And what I learned, I passed on. And so, the only way to change this isn't, we might think, well, what do I do about that? Do I say, Christine, you need to talk to me? Do I teach her communication skills? Is she the problem? She's not the problem, is she? The only way to change that is to change me, is to change this right here. This is what's got to change. If there's going to be any kind of different future, any kind of legacy, if there's going to be any fewer regrets, if we're going to learn how to dance, that's where it's got to be. And this is a compelling story of how a person makes that change. Now, I don't know about you, but man, that is what I want more than anything else in life, to be better than I am today. By God's grace, with God's help, to be the person I might. How does that happen? Well, that's the rest of this story. And we're going to see that in next week's gospel. And not next week's Old Testament lesson. It is, in many ways, one of my favorite stories in the whole Bible. Such an incredible story, filled with so much good stuff. And in it, we're going to begin to see how it is that a person really does change, and how the future doesn't need to repeat the past. All right? So think about the stories we tell. Are they stories you want to change? After the last service, somebody come up and said, I've been thinking about how one of the stories we tell is, my child is so naughty, and then we all laugh about it, my naughty child. And she said, but as I think about that, I realize how that's creating behavior, and I need a different story. And then, think about how it is we reap what we sow. What is it that you're sowing now? And are you being intentional, very, very intentional about what you're sowing? If you're not, you're sowing by default what has already been sown, and likelihood is that's a mix of good and bad. And if you come to that point where you say, man, tomorrow I cannot afford to be the person that I am today, well, then come back next week, because we're going to talk about how that becomes the case. Amen? Amen. Amen.